the attacks increase. What are you hearing from Kiev? People there have been bracing for a full Russian assault for days now.
That assault did not happen. In fact, a lot of military gear, tanks, and the soldiers are in the outskirts, basically, of Kiev, around 20 to 30 kilometers outside of the city center. It's unclear, actually, why. There's a lot of speculation around it. Low moral, a lack of very basics like gasoline to move ahead, and everyone is expecting them to regroup now and to look for a new strategy. People on the ground in Kiev are concerned that that strategy may only mean what we see play out in Kharkiv already, that basically people have to spend not just their nights but days in bomb shelters because shelling is so intense. No one exactly knows what's just going to happen in Kiev in the next couple of days, even though everyone is expecting the worst. And in that situation comes the appeal of President Zelensky urging to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but we have heard yesterday at the NATO meeting that NATO clearly says this is not our conflict, we don't want to get involved. So there obviously also a level of frustration here on the Ukrainian government side, because they feel this bombardment continues on so many levels, on so many cities, but they feel how are we actually going to win this war, they say, against Russia if there is no increasing help here to appeal the Russian forces, to continuously appeal them.
Right, Fanny Fashade reporting from Western Ukraine. Thank you. And the US ambassador to the United Nations says that Russian forces are closing in on Ukraine's second largest nuclear plant. She told the UN Security Council that they're now about 30 kilometers from Yuzhno-Ukrainsk in the south. On Friday, Ukraine said it narrowly avoided nuclear disaster at its largest nuclear plant, Zaporizhzhia, when Russia seized control of the facility. Russian troops fired shells at the plant, killing several people and sparking a fire. Authorities say the reactors were not damaged and no radioactive material was released. For more, let's bring in Mikhail Bushev from the DW Russia desk in Bonn. Mikhail, what more do we know about this second largest nuclear plant, its safety mechanisms, the situation there right now?
Good morning. Yes, we know something about the situation from the workers still allowed to do their work, but they're exhausted. That's what the director of the atomic plant told the reporters. The situation is pretty critical. As far as we still don't know if the safety of the plant is guaranteed. There are no signals whatsoever about radiation. The director also said that the workers could not do all the checks needed to establish the level of radiation, but the International Atomic Energy Agency also told that other monitoring stations didn't check any rising radiation levels whatsoever in Europe. It's a huge atomic plant. It has 6 reactors. It's relatively new. The last one was built and started to produce energy in 1995. So, and it's huge. Its importance for Ukraine shouldn't be underestimated. I think it's around about 20% of
right.
the whole.
Right, Mikhail, but the worrying thing is that that largest plant, nuclear plant in Europe, is already under Russian control, and Russian troops are now moving in towards the second largest plant. What's Russia trying to achieve by attacking nuclear power plants? What's the end game here?
Well, there are some signals that Russia is sending by doing that. First of all, it looks like a severe breach of Geneva Convention, especially the additional protocol of 1977, which calls that no atomic energy plant may ever be attacked. So that's the one point. So they are signaling that they are ready to do whatever it takes to have their win over Ukraine, and it's kind of blackmailing and a show of force. We are ready to use whatever we need, and if it would be our and explode at an atomic plant will do that. That's basically signaling of readiness.
That is a worrying thought there. Mikhail Gubaev, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
The UN Refugee Agency says more than 1.2 million people have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries. Many of them are children fleeing with their mothers, while Ukrainian men stay and fight. Helpers in neighboring countries say children are arriving traumatized. DW correspondent Monika Shirajka reports from Przemysl, near the Polish border with Ukraine.
Around 40,000 people are arriving here each day. One refugee from Ukraine told me, war is something for adults, not for children. The children of Ukraine are fleeing war and are arriving here at this railway station near the border. They bring with them the trauma of upheaval, fear, and sometimes wars.
If there had been no war, our houses would have stood. My grandfather now sleeps with a gun. I think we can do it, that it will get better in Ukraine and that we will win. I cannot say anything. I waited so long, I cried so much, I have nothing to say. We spent a very long time on the train and a very long time standing. I'm grateful to Poland that it welcomes our compatriots in this way. What do you feel now? Joy. Joy. Sometimes there were sirens in the evening. The people hid all day in cellars and bunkers. My father is in Ukraine. A lot of my relatives also stayed. I'm afraid that many people will die because of this war.
Who is prepared to talk to their children about war? The parents are in shock themselves. Their country suddenly engulfed in war. The big picture is overwhelming. The focus for now is on their children.
We in Zaporozhye do not need to explain anything. The children there have seen everything with their own eyes. The situation there is difficult. They felt it all around them. Every day they sat in cellars without light, water, or heating. When our region came under heavy fire, when tanks were visible, the children were afraid. They said, "Mom, we're scared. Can we leave?" The children understood that there was a war, but they didn't understand why. Why were people shooting at each other? I don't explain it to them because I believe they're too young. In general, they know that there's a war, that there are explosions, and that someone wants to take our homeland away from us.
The war in Ukraine is changing everything. Here, a new generation of European refugees carry the baggage of trauma into their new lives.
You're watching DW News live from Berlin. There's plenty more news and plenty more information on our website. That is dw.com. I'm Monika Jones in Berlin from me and the team here. Thanks for watching. We'll be back with the latest at the top of the hour. See you then.
Stories that move people the world over. Information they provide. Opinions they want to express. DW on Facebook and Twitter. Up to date and in touch. Follow us. Are you ready to get a little more extreme? These places in Europe are smashing all the records. Step into a bold adventure. Just don't lose your grip. It's the treasure map for modern globetrotters. Discover some of Europe's record-breaking sights. Euromax, YouTube, and now also in book form.
Vladimir Putin's announcement at the weekend that he was increasing the alert level of Russia's nuclear forces is raising fears that the war that Russia has launched against Ukraine could turn into something even more dangerous, some kind of nuclear conflict. Well, I've taken a few minutes out of the TV studio here in Berlin at DW to speak to one of the world's leading experts on nuclear weapons. His name is James Acton. He's based at the Carnegie Endowment think tank in Washington, D.C. And he writes and researches a lot about nuclear weapons and how escalation can happen between nuclear powers. So I asked him, what exactly, first of all, was it that Vladimir Putin has announced? Please bear with us, there's some banging in the background.
So Putin ordered the Russian defense minister and the Russian chief of staff to increase the alert level of Russia's deterrent forces, which includes but is not limited to Russia's nuclear forces. We don't know exactly what that's going to entail in practice. We wait to see. There's been media reporting that the US government has not seen any changes to Russia's nuclear force posture yet. We may not see any. I hope we don't see any.
What is your most likely interpretation of the signal he's trying to achieve with this?
I can offer you various interpretations, but I actually find this quite a difficult threat to understand what Putin is trying to do. One possibility is that he's trying to say to the US, stay out of this conflict, do not intervene directly, which is a threat that he actually made explicitly when he announced his invasion to the Russian people. Another possibility is that he's trying to make the US and its allies change their behavior, to back off, to lift sanctions, to stop supplying equipment and material to Ukraine. Another possibility is that this threat is targeted at Ukraine itself. He's trying to scare them into backing down or increase his leverage at the negotiating table. And given that Russian-Ukrainian negotiations now appear to be ongoing. Part of actually what concerns me here is it's not clear precisely what Putin hopes to achieve through this threat, what specifically he's threatening.
And how should people understand the importance of this, even in any of those interpretations? How unusual is it for a leader, especially a leader of a superpower, to make a threat like this?
It's unusual, but not entirely unprecedented. If you look back through the history of Russian and US-Soviet crises, the last time that one of those states alerted their nuclear forces during a crisis was in October 1973, during the final stages of the Yom Kippur War. So you have to go back almost 50 years to find an occasion, to find the most recent and kind of roughly analogous occasion to this. That, I think, underscores how unusual this kind of nuclear threat actually is. I don't think that Putin is about to launch a nuclear attack tomorrow, but I do think that the danger of nuclear war, the likelihood of nuclear war, is rising. And we should think about this in terms of risk, which is the risk is the product of probability and consequence. And while the probability of a nuclear war is still fortunately quite small, the consequences are so large that the risk here, in my mind, is high right now.
So we have Putin in this situation, making this threat. The Western world is looking at this and thinking, well, what is the best response at this stage? What is your advice to the US administration and leaders here in Europe who are thinking about how their messaging should be now after this threat?
Right now, my advice is twofold. Firstly, it is to stay the course in terms of their military posture at the moment. There is no need whatsoever to increase the alert level of American or British or French nuclear forces. What I would try to do, though, is to give Putin an off-ramp. Ultimately, Ukraine has to negotiate an end to this conflict if it's to survive as a nation state, as well as it's been doing on the battlefield. The extraordinary performances of its armed forces. I think the Ukrainians know that if they want to avoid, the leveling of their cities, as Putin did to Grozny in 1999 to 2000, they have to negotiate. So I think, we should make it clear which sanctions we're willing to lift if Russia and Ukraine can negotiate a ceasefire. I think that is worth something that's conveying to the Russians right now. In short, we have to try to find a way so that Putin can back out of this crisis in a way that leaves Ukraine as an independent state. That's not easy to do. We can't make him take that pathway, but we can at least open the door in the hope that he will walk through it.
But given the fact that he has brought this nuclear threat element into this conflict, how easy is it to back down from such high stakes to accepting a solution which feels well below the rather maximalist war aims with which he went into this conflict?
Putin is faced with a bunch of unattractive options right now, right? Negotiating a ceasefire in a way that preserves Ukraine as an independent state is an unattractive option. Fighting a prolonged war against Ukraine that is a complete bloodbath and results in the deaths of tens and tens of thousands of Russian service members is really unattractive. Using nuclear weapons is really unattractive. So it's not as though Putin has good options here, some that he wants to pursue. He's faced with a bunch of lousy options, and he has to choose the least bad of those. Putin is a position that many leaders find themselves when they launch wars that prove a lot less successful than they hoped they would be. And at the end of the day, almost all wars end through a negotiated process in which each side has to make agonizing concessions that it hates to make. My point is that we should try to speed up that process so that, we make Putin as likely as we can do. There's a lot here that's out of our control. We want to make it as likely as possible that Putin takes this face-saving way out of this crisis as soon as possible in a way that doesn't involve the destruction of Ukrainian cities or worse still, the use of nuclear weapons.
So that would be the kind of positive trajectory where the West can try to nudge Putin towards a positive or a least bad outcome. What's the alternative? Where do you see the risk of a chain of escalations that lead to a nuclear use?
There's various pathways that you can imagine, but the one that honestly worries me the most in this situation is the pathway in which Putin's nuclear threats on this occasion fail, as I think they will. I don't think they're going to cause Ukraine to back down or the US and its allies to back down. And Putin is left fighting a bloodbath of a prolonged conventional war, in which the Russian economy is in tatters, Russian soldiers are being killed left, right, and center. There is no end in sight of this conflict, in which Putin perhaps starts to worry about whether his rule at home might be threatened. So in that kind of scenario, the possibility that as a last desperate roll of the dice to try to bring an end to this conflict, Putin uses nuclear weapons, I can't exclude that possibility, and that's the thing that worries me most.
And what kind of use of nuclear weapons would we be looking at there? Is it where he might use them in Ukraine itself, or that he might use them outside Ukraine as some kind of warning to Western powers? What kind of scenarios can you imagine most likely?
In principle, it could be either of those. I think it's very hard to predict. What I would say is we may learn more in the next few days about Putin's thinking in this regard. It's possible that the alert order was completely a bluff. I think that's unlikely, and that Putin's bluffing theory of international politics hasn't done very well over the last few months. But we could see Russia alert its strategic nuclear forces. That's its nuclear forces that can reach the United States. It might place nuclear warheads on bombers. It might send more submarines to sea. In all of those different cases there, Putin would be clearly leveling a threat at the United States. And if it progressed to nuclear use in that scenario, one would expect Russia's long-range nuclear weapons to be used. Conversely, Russia also has a large variety of non-strategic delivery systems that can't reach the United States. On a day-to-day basis, those delivery systems are not stored with nuclear warheads. If we saw Russia start to move nuclear warheads from the storage locations to the deployment location of its non-strategic weapons, then Russia would likely be trying to convey a nuclear threat to Ukraine. And in that case, if it ended up in nuclear use, then I think the target would be Ukraine. So I think we will know a bit more.
Сейчас, секунду. Да, слушаю.
Евгений Маратович, добрый день.
Да, это я, да, слушаю.
Это вам звонят из Центра детского творчества. Вы к нам подходили по поводу работы?
Да.
Я переговорила с директором. К сожалению, вакансий у нас нет.
Понял.
Да.
Это где вы, подождите, это Делистери, да?
Это клубная 50А.
Клубная 50А.
У нас была договоренность, что я позвоню вам до конца недели.
Ага, ой, понял. Ладно, хорошо, понял.
До свидания.
Понял.
About possible scenarios when and if Russia's nuclear posture visibly changes in the next few days. Like, hopefully it won't, but if it does, that will give us a bit more about tell us a bit more about Putin's thinking.
And where is the deterrent effect of the West's nuclear forces here? Because we're talking about actions which would see Vladimir Putin using nuclear weapons where nobody else has used them, and facing the potential for some kind of massive retaliation, perhaps also in a nuclear sense. So, why these thoughts even possible? given the potential retaliatory consequences?
Well, I mean, firstly, Richard, I'd point out that this kind of nuclear use is not unprecedented. In fact, it's the only precedented form of nuclear use, is nuclear use to try to end a conventional war in a way to avoid a huge amount of conventional fighting. Obviously, the big difference between the end of the Second World War in the Pacific and today is Japan didn't have a nuclear-armed ally in 1945. Ukraine, the US isn't a formal ally, but it's a friend of Ukraine. And, I think US nuclear forces and French and British nuclear forces will weigh heavily on Putin's psyche. He will be fully aware that the use of nuclear weapons could lead to retaliation. That's why I think he's unlikely to do it. But I think the rationale here is that he will weigh up the consequences of using them and the consequences of not using them. And if the consequences of not using them appear really terrible, the loss of some dreadful conventional war in a way that threatens, in Putin's mind, grip on power, then I think you start to get in a situation in which you may view the risks of using them as being lower than the risks of not using them.
And you said that, maybe to close here, you said that there hasn't been something, an alert of this nature since 1973. That's a long time ago. How dangerous is this moment? Is it also, do you feel, the most dangerous moment in world affairs since around that time?
I find it very hard to quantify the level of danger that we now face. I do think at the very least this is the most dangerous moment in a US-Russia crisis since not only the end of the Cold War, but at least, the last 5 or so years of the Cold War.
Thanks to James Acton for taking the time today. And if you want to follow more of our coverage of the crisis, then follow us on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram, and of course on our own website, dw.com.
What's making the headlines and what's behind them?
DW News Africa.
The show that tackles the issues shaping the continent.
Life is slowly getting back to normal here. We're on the streets to give you in-depth reports and insights.
Our correspondents on the ground reporting from across the continent.
All the trends that matter to you. Next on DW. What people have to say matters to us. That's why we listen to their stories. Reporter, every weekend on DW.
This is DW News Africa. On the program today, the Africans struggling to escape the conflict in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing the fighting in Ukraine. Among them are tens of thousands of African students. We hear how one made it to safety and of her harrowing experience as she tried to get out of the country.
It was very tough. It was horrible. I remember I was shivering, literally.
Plus, countries around the world overwhelmingly denounced Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a UN vote. But why did so many African countries refuse to do so? Also coming up, we will meet the group of Malians calling for their country to ditch Western partners and strengthen ties with Moscow instead. And in another big development this week, one that some are calling a watershed moment for the planet, UN countries gathered at a summit in Nairobi agreed to create a legally binding treaty that they say will end plastic pollution. Hello, I'm Christine Mundwa. It's good to have your company. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered a historic mass movement of people not seen in Europe in decades. More than 1 million people have already fled the country, according to the UN's refugee agency, and that number is growing by the day. Among those fleeing Russia's bombs are African students studying at universities in Ukraine. According to Ukrainian officials, there were about 16,000 of them before the conflict began. Some of them have reported receiving racist treatment from Ukrainian officials, who they say pushed them back as they tried to flee. Now, some African students are still in Ukraine and trying to get out, and others are in other European countries. Some have left for Africa, like one medical student who is now safely back home in Ghana. She shared her experience with us.
Together again, Priscilla Ajar and her father Samuel, after a terrifying week. The fifth-year medical student was studying at a university in western Ukraine when the war broke out.
It was very tough. It was horrible. Like, I remember I was shivering, literally, when my school said that, okay, you guys could go home. I was like, which means that the school sees the intensity of it now.
There was similar fear back home in Ghana. Her family was closely monitoring events in faraway Ukraine, and not for the first time.
The anxiety is a reminiscent of what happened in 2014, because in 2014, my son was also in Donetsk, and the same issue happened, and they had to virtually run from Donetsk to the capital, Kyiv. So when the second one also started for last week, a whole lot of anxiety, emotional trauma, let's put it that way. The entire family was put into that.
Priscilla made for the border closest to her city.
And we took a bus. So after we just took a bus, and then after some time, the buses were not moving, vehicles are not moving anymore. So we had to trek for, I think, over an hour and a half. Yes, so that's how we got to the border. And then the border, it was messy. So many people, Ukrainians, Ghanaians, Nigerians, Zimbabweans, Egyptians, Indians, everybody in Chelsea was going there.
She crossed into Romania and, like many other Ghanaian students, made it back home safely. But Priscilla still has major concerns as the war escalates in Ukraine.
So let's say that they destroy everything in the country. The country has to go through redevelopmental stages again. So what's at stake for us? I don't know if our school buildings will be destroyed, whatever. So it's quite burdensome, and it's worrying, very worrying, that we don't know if we can go back to school, if we would finish, if we would complete. Are we going to go back to square one, or what?
The answers might not come for a while, but being with family can be the great comfort Priscilla and others like her need right now.
Now, Priscilla Aja and others are safely home now, but many others are not. While some have made it out of Ukraine and are now in neighboring countries, there are still some African nationals stuck in Ukraine and trying to get out. Earlier, I spoke to Husseini Umar Madakawi. He's the chairperson of the Nigerian diaspora in Hungary. He was at the border between Hungary and Ukraine.
We are here to assist Nigerians, guide them how to get to the city. We brought along with us from Budapest some humanitarian clothes, some winter clothes, and some items for those who arrived from Ukraine. We help them, guide them to the United States, where the United States for them to be evacuated.
Husseini, we were hearing, or have been hearing, accounts of Africans trying to leave Ukraine. They've been reporting that they've been not allowed into trains leaving Ukraine. They say they've experienced racism and ill treatment from Ukrainian officials that are on the ground. Are you still hearing accounts? Is this still continuing to happen as people try to leave Ukraine?
Well, we hear about this situation, but we cannot verify it because our job is limited to coming to Hungarian border. What's happening at the Ukrainian border, we have no idea, but we have people calling and making complaints that they are being taken off from the train, from the buses, but we don't know for what reason.
Husseini, how many people do you know of that are still in Ukraine and want to get out? What are they telling you?
It's very difficult to predict how many people are still in Ukraine because we don't have the actual number of them before now. So all I know that it's not only me, all the executive of NIDO, Hungary, we share our phone numbers. They are calling us, getting to get information on what to do, how to come to Hungary, and what help can we offer them. We tell them what we can do for them. And some parents, of course, out of desperation, they are calling and crying and telling us that their children are dying, their children are in the border and they don't know what to do. We try to calm them down and tell them we are on top of the situation. In synchron with the embassy, we are trying to do our best to see what we can do for them and how we can help them. We guide many of them to the hotel, to a place where the charity organization is providing shelter for them. The NIDO Hungary now provide food for them. We have volunteers who go there to cook for them, and we share all the pictures of what we... Yes,
understood,
please.
But sorry, we're talking about the people who are still in Ukraine right now. We'll talk about those that have left. But for those who are still in Ukraine, what kind of support do they need to leave?
Many of them are on their way. So the question they ask mainly is that which is the easiest border for them to cross. So as I told you earlier, that as they are scattered in Ukraine, in different cities, whichever border is closer for them to go, that's where we will advise to go. So we don't restrict them to come into Hungary because some of them are not closer to Hungarian border.
Okay. And for those that have now managed to get out and are now, some are in Poland, Slovakia, and others in Hungary, where you are, what is their situation there?
The situation is still chaotic. We're trying to gather them, register them, put them in the hotel. We have charity organizations that offer, including some district counties, offer places for those coming in to accommodate them for a short period of time, and we are just directing them there.
That was Husseini Umar Madakawi speaking to us from the border between Hungary and Ukraine. Now, the first group of more than 400 Nigerians evacuated from Ukraine have landed in Abuja. The group comprised mostly of students. They arrived on a government-chartered flight from Romania's capital, Bucharest. They are among 14,000 Nigerian nationals who were known to be in Ukraine before the war began. That's according to the Nigerian Foreign Ministry's figures. Now, it is unclear if and when they can go back to Ukraine. Now, this week, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly denounced Russia for invading Ukraine. But while most of the world stood together in rebuking Russia's aggression, many African countries opted to stay neutral and not take a stance. In a vote at the UN General Assembly, 141 countries voted in favor of a resolution that also ordered Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Only 4 countries joined Russia in voting against the resolution. Of the 35 countries that abstained, 17 are from Africa. They include Zimbabwe, Uganda, Senegal, and South Africa. To talk more about that, we invited the analyst Anu Adeoye from the think tank Chatham House onto the program. He has been researching ties between African countries and Russia. I asked him why he thinks many African nations chose to abstain in that UN vote and to what extent that reflects the views of ordinary people in these countries.
I mean, ultimately, the reasons why a few of these countries, like South Africa and Zimbabwe, for example, gave for abstaining was the fact that they said that they did not see anything in the resolution that would have made peace easier to achieve in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So I think the surprising thing for me as an analyst is that if both of these countries thought the resolution was not well written, I think they should have voted it down instead of abstaining from the vote yesterday.
All right. As I was saying, you focus on Russia in Africa. That is the focus of your work. How would you characterize Russia's presence in Africa today? Is Russia a significant player in and on the continent?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you define significance. But the truth of the matter is Russia has an eye on Africa. Since 2014, after it annexed Crimea in Ukraine, it has decided that it needs a pivot to find partners outside of the West. And Africa is one such place where it has decided to seek new partners. Russia's main strategy in Africa has been defense and security partnership, but it is also trying to increase trade links with African countries. At the UN Security Council just earlier this year, it supported Mali, a country that it is growing closer to, by blocking the votes on ECOWAS sanctions on Mali. So that's part of Russia's strategy on Africa, to try and increase trade links, but also get some support for its position at multilateral organizations like the UN.
Understood. And let's stay on Mali, as you've brought Mali up. I want to specifically ask you about that country, because we know Mali has been battling this jihadist insurgency for just about a decade now. And last month, France and other Western allies announced that they will be withdrawing their presence from that country. And it's almost, it's been said that Russia is going to be filling that void. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, as you said, Mali has been battling some Islamist insurgency for almost a decade now. Last year, President Emmanuel Macron announced that he was going to reduce the number of French troops in the Sahel. And the way the Malians responded was to say that they were going to shop for new security partners. But I think there's more to this. There's obviously more to the story than just France drawing out some of their troops. As you well know, there have been two coups in Mali. First in August 2020 and secondly in May 2021. That has led to a rupture in relationship between France and Mali. And so in that vacuum, the Russian private military company called Wagner has stepped in to fill the role. And I think for people who don't know, Wagner is a private military company that is often deployed to hotspots around the world. They have fought in Syria, they have fought in Libya, they've been in Central African Republic, and now they are going to be in Mali to assist their partners in Mali.
All right, that is Anu Adeode talking to us there from the Chatham House think tank. Thank you, Anu. Let's stay with Mali, because not only was the country among those who didn't condemn Russia in that UN vote, but it is one example of a country seeking closer ties with Russia, especially as the long-standing relationship with the former colonial power France deteriorates. DW's West Africa correspondent Rosh Chikura is in the country, and she met a group who see Russia as the best partner for the country going forward.
Abat la France. Now that loosely translates to thumbs down France, and that's one of the major messages of this group, the Yerowolo movement. Now the Yerowolo movement has been growing very fast here in Mali. They started in 2019 with only 12 members, and now they tell me they can't even keep tabs with exactly how many people are members of the group. And many people here in Mali believe that this group is the only hope for the future of a truly independent Mali. Adama Ben Diarra is leading this movement. He was at the forefront of the massive protests that led to the ousting of the French ambassador and the French military. He is now a member of the transition parliament, and he is pushing for stronger ties between Mali and Russia.
It's only logical that we're pursuing a win-win relationship with Russia. Russia was our first partner after independence, and we found that Russia is sincere in their partnership. That's why we prefer Russia over France. Our choice is justified because Russia has never colonized any country.
Mali's partnership with Moscow runs deep. Mali receives most of its military equipment from Russia. Hundreds of Russian mercenaries operating under the Kremlin-linked Wagner Group are deployed in Mali, and most of the current military leaders were trained in Russia. Many even speak the language. Some observers, however, say strengthening the Russian-Malian relationship might not be the best solution in the long run.
Maybe today it just feels like the military answer is the best answer. So probably, even if you look at world ranking, Russia would be a better option because it's the second, military power in the world. But economically, it's not the best partnership for us. I think if we want to fix things, we have to fix us. We have to fix ourselves.
If it was up to the Yerawolo movement, Mali would cut ties to France entirely. That seems almost impossible though, as French influence pervades almost every aspect of life here.
They're calling it a watershed moment for the planet. UN countries have agreed to create a legally binding global treaty to address plastic pollution in the world's oceans and rivers and landscape.
I see no objections. It is so decided.
The UN Environment Assembly voted unanimously at this meeting in the Kenyan capital Nairobi for a resolution to end plastic pollution. It sets the stage for international negotiations designed to produce a treaty by 2024. The treaty would cover the full life cycle of plastics, including production, design, and disposal. The head of the UN Environment Program said it was an historic step.
The bottom line is we will eliminate plastic pollution from our environment, and that is critical. And so without a doubt, this is a very, very big decision.
And for more on this, we've invited Richard Munang onto the program. He is the Deputy Director of the UN Environment Assembly's Africa office. He's also Climate Coordinator for Africa, and he joins me now from Nairobi, where the summit has been taking place. Welcome to DW News Africa, Richard. You've described the passing of this resolution as history being made. Tell us, why is it so significant, Richard? What will it change?
Thank you very much for having me. This resolution that have been adopted by the United Nations Environment Assembly UNEA 5.2 is quite very significant because we are at a time when the environmental challenges are actually on the weight of the entire world. And if you look at plastics, it's not just a menace to the environment, but as we speak today, every year 11 million tons of plastics are actually getting into the oceans and littering and destroying aquatic life and killing up to 100,000 marine animals. This is a huge
solution that will effectively end this.
Смотри, это пластик, плавает, убивает морских зверей, да, там, таких же, смотри, это же выгодно, их можно кушать, этих зверей. То есть открываешь ресторан на воде, и часть продовольственного просто закрыта, ну или там, не знаю, да. Ну а куда деваться? Ну тогда... Ну пока очищают, а потом уже не надо. А чего они зря продавают? Корейцы пригнали, нет? Не знаю. Пластик на воде. Может, я плохо выгляжу, да? Плохо. Да-да.
Займов Екапуста, ОМ Интерфинанс, менеджер по работе с клиентами, разговор в записи.